At Gravel Switch Station, Clara Baines watched the man who had paid for her train ticket choose another bride before he even asked her name. She had traveled 9 days from Cincinnati with one carpetbag, 2 dresses, and a folded letter promising marriage at the end of the rails. But Edmund Voss took one look at Clara's work-rue hands, then one look at the polished Denver widow, stepping down from the same train in a violet traveling coat, and decided the letter had been meant for the wrong woman. "I'm sorry for the confusion," he said, though he did not sound sorry. "A man in my position needs a wife who will improve his standing." He pressed $3 silver into Clara's palm. Not enough for a ticket back, not enough for a room, just enough to make the insult look civilized. Then he offered his arm to the widow and walked away. Clara did not call after him. She did not beg. She did not cry. She had learned long before that tears did not buy bread, did not soften landlords, and did not make cruel men turn around. So she stood beneath the station awning while the other passengers scattered into wagons and dust, holding those $3 so tightly the coins cut half-moons into her skin. That was when a man's voice came from behind the freight crates. "Mom," he said quietly. "That was a poor thing he did." Clara turned. A tall rancher stood a few paces away with his hat crushed in both hands. He looked as if he would rather face a stampede than speak to a strange woman at a train station. His coat was sun-faded. His boots were split at the seams. His knuckles carried old rope scars and new work. "My name is Jonah Reed," he said. "I run Willow Draw Ranch, 7 miles north of here." Clara studied him carefully. Kindness was not always kindness. Sometimes it was only another door closing behind you. "What do you want, Mr. Reed?" He looked down at the hat in his hands, then back at her. "I came to town to place an advertisement of my own. Not a fancy one, just honest. I need help at my place. I have 2 little girls. Their mother has been gone 3 years, and I have done a poor job pretending one man can be a whole household." Behind the crates, something shifted. A pair of little boots scraped the boards. Jonah closed his eyes for one tired second. "Girls, if you followed me this far, you may as well come out." 2 children stepped into view. The older one was 6, narrow-chinned and fierce, with dark braids tied in uneven ribbons. The younger was 4, round-eyed, clutching a rag doll by one limp arm. Both wore dresses that had been mended so many times the patches looked like part of the cloth. The older girl stared straight at Clara. "Are you the lady Papa was hoping for?" "Nora," Jonah warned. The younger one hid half behind her sister and whispered, "She looks tired, Nora." Clara almost laughed. It came out closer to a breath. "I am tired," she said. Nora considered that with the solemn judgment of a child who had learned not to trust easy answers. "Can you stay tired and still make biscuits?" For the first time since the train pulled in, Clara's mouth softened. "I have made biscuits while hungry, wet, fevered, and angry. Tired is not much of an obstacle." Jonah looked at her then, really looked as if he had just heard more than she meant to tell. "I'm not asking you to marry a stranger today," he said. "I'm asking you to come see the ranch. There is a room with a bed and a lock that works. You can stay a few days. Meet the girls proper. Decide what you want. If you choose to leave, I will put you on the first train I can afford, and no debt will follow you." Clara looked at the empty platform. Edmund Voss was already gone in a polished carriage, beside a woman whose gloves had never touched lye water. The town behind her did not know her name. The road ahead of her held a rancher too nervous to lie well, and two motherless girls watching as if her answer mattered. "All right," Clara said. "I will see your ranch." The ride north was not comfortable. The wagon seat was rough, the wind carried dust, and Jonah's old gray mule objected to every rise in the road as if personally betrayed by Wyoming territory. But the land opened around Clara in a way that made her chest ache. No brick walls crowding the sky, no wash-house steam burning her throat, no boarding-room ceiling 6 inches above her hope. Only pale grass, low hills, cottonwoods along a creek bed, and a sky so wide it made every sorrow look smaller by force. Nora sat in the wagon bed with her arms crossed, guarding the flour sack as if it were gold. "Can you sew?" "Yes." "Can you shoot?" "No." "Can you milk?" "I can learn." "Can you read?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Enough." That answer made Jonah glance at her. "Enough for what?" "Enough to know when a paper is trying to trap me." He did not press. The younger girl, Elsie, crawled closer to the back of the bench. "Do you sing?" Clara looked out at the moving grass. "Not for people." Elsie accepted this for only half a mile. Then, very softly, she began humming to her rag doll, as if offering Clara a way in without asking again. By the time Willow Draw Ranch came into view, the sun was sliding low and red behind the hills. The place was not pretty in the way town women meant pretty. The barn leaned slightly east. The porch sagged at one corner. A line of wash snapped against a rope. Chickens scratched under the steps as though they owned the house by older claim. But smoke rose from the chimney. A water barrel stood full. The fences, though patched, were standing. It was not elegant. It was alive. Jonah helped Clara down from the wagon with an awkward care that made no claim on her. "I know it is not much." Clara looked at the house, the creek beyond it, the two girls racing inside to warn the cat, and the man beside her who had not once asked whether she was pretty. "It is more than I had this morning," she said. The room he gave her was small enough that she could touch one wall from the bed and nearly reach the other. But the mattress was clean. The latch worked. The quilt had tiny blue stars stitched into the corners, each one made by hands patient enough to believe in winter nights ending. "My sister made that before she married East," Jonah said from the doorway. "She said every house ought to have one room ready for Mercy." Clara looked down at the quilt. Mercy had always been something other people discussed from dry porches. She had never slept under it. That first supper was beans, corn cakes, and one apple divided 4 ways. Nora watched every move Clara made with narrowed eyes. Elsie spilled molasses on her sleeve and immediately cried, as though she had ruined the only good thing left in the world. Jonah tried to cut bread, answer both children, check the stove, and apologize for the state of the house, all at the same time. Clara stood, took the knife gently from his hand, and finished the meal without a word. Not because she belonged there. Not yet. Because chaos was something she understood. After the girls finally fell asleep, Jonah sat across from her at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched. "I should tell you the truth before morning." Clara folded her hands. "Their mother, Ruth, was not wicked," he said. "I need you to know that. She was young, younger than I understood. She came west because I promised her a home, but a home this far out can feel like a locked box if it is not the one you dreamed of." His voice roughened. After Elsie was born, Ruth changed. Some mornings she would not speak. Some evenings she would shake if the baby cried. I thought more work would fix it. More flour, more wood, more money. I was a fool. Clara did not interrupt. One February night she took my coat and walked toward town. The snow covered her tracks before sunup. We found her 2 days later in a ravine. Jonah swallowed hard. Nora remembers the door opening. Elsie remembers nothing. I have been afraid of both things ever since. Clara looked toward the bedroom where the girls slept tangled in one blanket. "You are afraid I will leave." "I am afraid you should," he admitted. "This life is not kind to women. And I am afraid if you stay, the girls will love you before they know whether they get to keep you." That was the first honest thing anyone had given Clara in weeks. Not silver, not pity, truth. "I cannot promise I know how to mother anyone," she said. "I have never had one long enough to study. I cannot promise I will make this house graceful. I cannot promise the girls will like me once they learn I have rules." Jonah's mouth moved, almost a smile. "But I know what it means to be left standing where someone else decided your worth. I know what it means to wake up and still do the work. If that is the kind of help you need, I can try." His eyes shone in the lamplight. "That is more than I expected to hear. It is not a vow," Clara said. "No," Jonah answered. "It is better. It is honest." The days that followed did not turn gentle just because Clara had agreed to stay. Willow Draw worked her from before sunrise until after dark. There were shirts to scrub, chickens to chase, bread to burn once before learning the stove's temper, water to haul, beans to sort, floors to sweep, and 2 children who seemed to multiply whenever mud was near. Nora tested Clara with the focus of a small judge. She left knots in the thread basket. She claimed she hated stew, then ate 2 bowls when Clara told the story of a queen who disguised carrots as treasure. She asked, at the worst possible moments, whether Clara was planning to go back to the station. Elsie was softer, but not easier. She followed Clara from room to room, with the rag doll under her arm, asking questions so small they hurt. "Will your bed stay in that room? Do you know how to braid without pulling? When ladies leave, do they know little girls are watching?" Clara never lied to her. "I do not know why some ladies leave," she said one evening, combing Elsie's fine hair by the stove. "But I know I am here tonight." Elsie leaned back against her knees. "Tonight is good." Slowly the house began to change. Not grandly. A curtain appeared where a flour sack had hung. The girls' dresses lost their worst tears. The porch steps stopped wobbling after Clara held the lantern while Jonah fixed them. Supper came at the same hour, often enough that the children stopped asking whether there would be any. And Jonah began leaving little things without ceremony. A bucket filled before she woke, a stack of kindling by the stove, a slate for the girls wrapped in newspaper. Once, a handful of prairie lilies in a chipped jar, placed at the table as if flowers often grew there by accident. Clara never thanked him too warmly. He never waited to be thanked. That was how trust entered the house. Sideways, quietly, carrying water. But town did not let happiness grow unexamined. At the Mercantile one Saturday, Clara stood with Nora and Elsie while Jonah loaded seed outside. She was choosing needles when the room changed shape around her. Women stopped speaking. A man near the coffee tins gave a short laugh. Edmund Voss stood at the counter in a new black coat, the Denver widow nowhere in sight. "Well," he said, "if it is not the bride who missed her appointment." Clara kept her hands steady on the needle packet. "I did not miss it, Mr. Voss. You refused it." His smile tightened. "I made a practical correction. Though I hear you corrected yourself quickly enough. Reed always did pick up what others left behind." Nora's face went white with fury. Clara put one hand lightly on the child's shoulder. Edmund leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to seem polite. "You ought to be careful. A woman without kin cannot afford to make herself talked about. Reed has daughters, a house, land, reputation. What do you have besides an unfortunate arrival?" The answer rose in Clara like heat. "Nothing." That was what the world kept telling her. Nothing but hands, nothing but endurance, nothing but the ability to survive things other people caused. Before she could speak, Elsie stepped from behind Nora, small and shaking. "She has us." The Mercantile went still. Edmund looked down, surprised to find himself opposed by a child. Then Jonah was in the doorway, holding a sack of seed on one shoulder. His eyes moved from Edmund to Clara, then to the girls. He set the sack down carefully. "Voss," he said, very calm, "you will not speak to Miss Baines again." Edmund gave a laugh. "You giving orders now, Reed?" "No, I am giving you a chance to leave while you still look like a gentleman." It was not a loud threat. That made it worse. Edmund looked around the store and found no friendly face worth borrowing. He took his parcel and walked out. The town exhaled. Jonah turned to Clara, anger fading into something more dangerous. Concern. "Are you all right?" Clara wanted to say yes. She had said yes to worse things with less reason. But Nora was still rigid beneath her hand. Elsie was crying silently into her skirt. And all at once, Clara understood the shape of the danger Jonah had feared from the start. If she stayed, they would need her. If she left later, she would not be a stranger leaving a house. She would be another mother disappearing through a door. That night, after the girls slept, Clara packed her carpet bag. Not all the way. Just enough to make a decision feel possible. Jonah found her in the little back room. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Did Voss frighten you that much?" "No," Clara said. "He reminded me what I am." Jonah stepped into the doorway. "And what is that?" "A woman who arrived by accident. A woman your children are starting to trust. A woman who might not know how to keep from breaking them if she fails." His expression changed. "Clara." She gripped the dress in her hands. When Elsie said she had me, I felt glad, then terrified. Because what if she is wrong? What if I am only a roof for a season? What if I become another story they have to recover from? Jonah came no closer. He knew enough by then not to crowd a frightened heart. "Do you want to leave?" That should have been simple. The word "no" filled her so completely she could not push it out. Before she found her voice, a scream tore through the house. Nora. Clara dropped the dress and ran. The bedroom window was open. The night wind pushed the curtain inward like a pale hand. Elsie was awake in bed, sobbing. "She went to the creek," Elsie cried. "She said if Miss Clara leaves, She can find Mama and ask how to make people stay." Jonah's face went dead with fear. They found the tracks behind the house, small prints in soft dirt heading toward the cottonwoods. Jonah grabbed a lantern. Clara grabbed the quilt from her bed without knowing why. The moon had slipped behind clouds, and the creek was swollen from 3 days of mountain rain. By daylight it was a shallow ribbon. By night it sounded like teeth. "Nora!" Jonah shouted. No answer. Clara moved ahead of the lantern, skirts snagging on brush. She did not know this land. She did not know where the ground dropped, where snakes hid, where water turned deep. But she knew children. She knew shame. She knew the desperate logic of a little girl who had decided love could be chased down in the dark. A thin cry came from below the bank. Clara was the first to see her. Nora clung to a willow root halfway down the muddy slope, one boot already in the current. Her face was streaked with dirt and terror. "I was not going to fall," Nora sobbed. "I was just looking." Clara dropped to her knees. "Look at me, Nora, not the water. Me." Jonah moved beside her, but the bank crumbled under his boot. Clara held out the quilt. "Grip this, both hands. I can't. You can. You tied 12 knots in my thread basket, and every one of them held like iron. Grip the quilt." Nora grabbed it. Jonah wrapped the other end around his arm. Clara lay flat in the mud and reached down until her shoulder burned. "Now, climb when I pull." The first pull failed. The second tore skin from Clara's palm. The third brought Nora close enough for Clara to catch the back of her dress and drag her over the edge into the mud. Jonah gathered his daughter so fiercely the lantern fell on its side and went dark. For a moment there was only breathing. Then Nora twisted out of her father's arms and crawled into Clara's lap. "I thought you were leaving," she said. Clara held her muddy quilt around both of them. "I was afraid." "Of us?" "Of hurting you." Nora pressed her wet face into Clara's chest. "Leaving hurts more." Those 2 words finished what Edmund Voss had started at the station. Not because they were gentle, because they were true. Clara looked over Nora's head at Jonah. His face was half shadow, half grief, and wholly open. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not trying. Not staying for now. Not tonight. I am not leaving." Jonah closed his eyes as if the words struck somewhere deeper than relief. The next morning Clara unpacked her carpet-bag in full view of both girls. She put one dress on the hook, then the other. She set her comb on the washstand. She placed her Bible, thin and cracked at the spine, beside the lamp. Elsie watched from the bed. "Is that how ladies stay?" Clara smoothed the quilt. "It is one way." Nora stood by the door with a bandage on her knee and guilt still stiff in her shoulders. "I am sorry I went to the creek. I know. Are you angry?" "Yes." Nora looked down. Clara crossed the room and knelt before her. "And I love you. Those 2 things can live in the same room." Nora stared at her. Then she threw both arms around Clara's neck so hard it hurt. Clara held on. After that night, Willow Draw no longer felt like a place Clara was visiting. It became the place that knew the sound of her steps. Spring came with green along the creek and a calf born backward in a rainstorm. Clara held the lantern while Jonah worked shoulder-deep in danger and mud. When the calf finally slid into the straw alive, Elsie named it Mercy before anyone could object. Summer came hot and hard. Clara learned to drive the wagon, then to milk without making the cow look offended, Then to ride the gentle bay mare Jonah swore had more patience than any saint. Nora learned letters at the kitchen table and pretended not to care when she read her first whole sentence. Elsie began sleeping through storms. Jonah changed too. The silence around him loosened. He laughed more often, not loudly, but as if the sound surprised him each time. He stopped apologizing for the house. He began asking Clara's opinion before buying seed, before selling a steer, before mending the north fence in a way she insisted would not hold. She was right. He admitted it in writing on a scrap of feed paper. Clara saved it. One Sunday in late August, Jonah took the girls to town and returned with a brown paper parcel tied in string. Nora carried it like a church offering. Elsie nearly burst from the effort of not telling. "For you," Jonah said. Inside was fabric, not silk, not vanity, something better. A length of deep blue wool, sturdy enough for winter, beautiful enough to make Clara forget she was allowed to want beautiful things. She touched it with 2 fingers. "This is too dear." "No," Jonah said. "It is overdue." Nora climbed onto the porch step beside her. "Papa said your old coat is more patch than coat," Elsie added, "and blue looks like mourning on you." Clara laughed once, then covered her mouth because it had come too close to a sob. Jonah sat beside her, leaving a careful space. "I do not know how to say this without making a poor job of it," he said. "So I will make a plain one. I love you, Clara Baines, not because the girls need you, though they do. Not because the ranch runs better, though heaven knows it does. I love you because when you came here, this house stopped feeling like it was only surviving." Clara looked at the fabric in her lap, at the girls watching with enormous eyes, at the man who had found her on the worst day of her life and never once treated her like the worst thing about her. "I love you too," she said. "All 3 of you. I think I began before I had the courage to know it." Elsie gasped. "Does this mean a wedding?" Nora said. "Only if he asks properly." Jonah took off his hat. Then, because the porch had become the holiest place he knew, he went down on one knee right there in the dust. "Clara, will you marry me? Not as a rescue, not as an arrangement. As my wife, and their mother, and the woman I would choose in any station, on any road, in front of any town." "Yes," Clara said. No train whistle marked the moment. No crowd saw it. Only 2 little girls cheered so loudly the chickens scattered. They married 3 weeks later in the whitewashed church at Gravel Switch. Clara wore the blue wool, sewn by her own hands, and finished at midnight with Nora asleep against her shoulder, and Elsie curled under the table with the rag doll. Jonah wore his best black coat, brushed so hard the seams nearly surrendered. Nora and Elsie walked ahead of Clara carrying jars of prairie lilies. Halfway down the aisle, Elsie forgot the instructions and handed every flower to one startled old man in the front pew. No one minded. Edmund Voss stood near the back, stiff as a fence post, because in a town that small pride sometimes dragged a man where conscience would not. The Denver widow was gone. Some said she had taken the eastbound train before the first frost. Some said she had left him a note so short it could fit inside a matchbox. Clara did not care. When her eyes passed over Edmund, she felt no triumph, only distance. He belonged to the station platform, to the closed door, to the $3 she no longer carried. Jonah belonged to the hand waiting at the altar, so she walked toward him. Years gathered around Willow draw the way good years do. Not loudly, not perfectly, but steadily enough to build a life. The sagging porch was rebuilt. The barn was straightened. The creek fence held after Clara redesigned it, and Jonah wisely stopped arguing. Calves became cattle. Cattle became school books, boots, roof shingles, and once, after a very good season, a real piano hauled from town in a wagon while Elsie wept from joy. Nora grew tall and exacting, with Clara's habit of folding truth into plain words. Elsie grew gentle without becoming weak, which Clara considered one of the finest achievements in the territory. More children came, a boy with Jonah's solemn eyes, a girl who sang before she spoke. Clara's hair silvered at the temples. Jonah's shoulders bent a little more each winter. The house filled with noise, arguments, bread, lessons, muddy boots, Sunday hymns, and the ordinary proof that love is not one rescue at a station. It is breakfast every morning after. It is staying through fever. It is mending what tears. It is learning which creek bank gives way after rain, and teaching the children never to trust it. One autumn evening, many years after the day Edmund Voss walked away from her, Clara sat on the porch beside Jonah while the sun lowered over Willow Draw. Nora's children were chasing Mercy's latest calf near the barn. Elsie was inside playing the piano badly and happily. The kitchen smelled of bread. Jonah reached for Clara's hand. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Voss had kept his promise? Clara looked toward the pasture, the creek, the rebuilt porch, the house that had once offered her one small room ready for Mercy. Then she looked at her husband. No, she said, I used to think he left me with nothing, but he only left me where I could finally be found. Jonah squeezed her hand. Clara watched the last light settle over the ranch, soft and gold and certain. Sometimes the door that closes in your face is not the end of the road. Sometimes it is the gate. And sometimes, if you are brave enough to walk through it, everything you were never chosen for becomes the life that chooses you back.